The story of the massacre of Teutoburg Forest is one of the most dramatic and haunting episodes in the long history of the Roman Empire. A tale that combines hubris, betrayal, brutal combat, and the sudden collapse of imperial ambition. It was in the year 9 CE when the Roman general Publius Quinctilius Varus led 3 legions along with cavalry and auxiliary forces into the dark, damp forests of Germania, expecting to reinforce the authority of Rome and cement its hold over a rebellious and unruly territory. What awaited them, however, was not a routine march to suppress unrest or administer Roman law, but a carefully laid trap orchestrated by a man who knew Roman tactics intimately, yet carried the loyalty of the Germanic tribes, Arminius, a chieftain of the Cherusei, who had once served Rome but who now planned its destruction. The disappearance of these legions would forever change the course of Roman expansion, shattering dreams of conquest across the Rhine and defining the boundary of the empire for centuries to come. To understand why 20,000 elite Roman soldiers vanished so suddenly and so completely, one must first appreciate the Roman mindset and military doctrine at the time. The empire under Augustus was at its height, having subdued most of the Mediterranean and brought the Pax Romana to regions long accustomed to war. The legions were professional, disciplined, and feared throughout the known world. Rome had crushed the Carthaginians, subdued Gaul under Julius Caesar, and annexed Egypt into its growing dominion. In the minds of Roman leaders, Germania was simply the next logical frontier, a vast land filled with tribes that could be subdued and then Romanized, much like Gaul. The Rhine River was already under Roman control, with strongholds like Mogontiacum and Vetera serving as bases for further advances. The tribes across the river, though fierce and proud, were regarded as backward and fragmented, unable to unite against the machine-like efficiency of the legions. What the Romans underestimated was the possibility of betrayal from within, a leader who could not only unite the tribes but also exploit Rome's overconfidence. Arminius was the key to the catastrophe that unfolded. Born a prince of the Cherusei, he had been sent as a hostage to Rome during his youth, part of the empire's common practice of taking the sons of tribal leaders as both insurance for loyalty and as a means of instilling Roman culture. During his time in Rome, Arminius learned Latin, studied Roman military discipline, and even rose to the rank of equestrian. He fought for Rome, gained citizenship, and was trusted by commanders such as Varus. To Varus, Arminius was an ally, a man who could bridge the divide between Rome and the tribes, easing the process of pacification and administration. Yet beneath this facade burned a deep resentment and a fierce loyalty to his homeland. Arminius recognized that the survival of Germania depended on preventing Rome from entrenching its authority. He also knew that Rome's greatest strength, its rigid discipline and reliance on order, could become its weakness in the tangled forests of his homeland. The campaign began innocuously enough. Varus, entrusted with maintaining order in Germania, received reports of unrest among the tribes. Arminius, ever the loyal intermediary, advised Varus to march deep into the territory to quell the rebellion. What Varus did not realize was that the rebellion itself was a fabrication, a ruse designed to lure the legions away from their fortified bases and into the heart of the forest, where terrain and weather would strip them of their advantages. The Roman army that Varus commanded was formidable on open ground, where its heavy infantry formations, cavalry support, and artillery could be deployed effectively. In the forests, however, these strengths became vulnerabilities. Narrow trails prevented legions from marching in their tight, protective formations. Wagons slowed the column, and rain turned the ground to mud, bogging down men and animals alike. The thick canopy of trees limited visibility, muffling sound, and creating an atmosphere of uncertainty. Here the Roman machine became clumsy, stretched out and vulnerable to ambush. The Germanic tribes, united under Arminius, waited for their moment. They had carefully prepared positions in the forest, erecting wooden walls, digging traps and cutting paths that would allow them to strike and vanish swiftly. When the Roman column entered these killing grounds, the attack fell with devastating precision. At first it may have seemed like mere harassment, arrows and javelins raining down from the trees, sudden charges from concealed warriors. But soon it became clear that the entire forest had turned hostile. The legions tried to regroup, but every attempt to form defensive lines or counterattack was disrupted by the terrain. Shields became heavy with rainwater, bows lost their tension, and armor that once gleamed in the sun became a burden in the damp chill of the woods. The discipline that made Rome invincible in open battle now hindered its soldiers as they struggled to adapt to guerrilla warfare. For days the battle raged not as a single confrontation, but as a prolonged slaughter. The Romans moved slowly, constantly under attack, never able to rest or resupply. The supply wagons became bottlenecks, the cavalry could not maneuver, and morale began to collapse as men realized they were surrounded and cut off. Accounts from later historians, such as Tacitus and Cassius Dio, describe a scene of horror, soldiers abandoning standards, men and animals sinking into swamps, officers trying in vain to rally their troops, only to be cut down by sudden rushes of Germanic warriors. Varus himself, recognizing the inevitability of defeat and unwilling to suffer capture, fell on his own sword, a grim act that symbolized the end of Roman command in the forest. Without leadership, the legions disintegrated into chaos. Some tried to flee, others surrendered only to be executed, and many were simply cut down where they stood. The aftermath was as brutal as the ambush itself. Captured Romans were sacrificed to Germanic gods, their heads nailed to trees as grim trophies. Standards, the sacred symbols of the legions, were seized by the tribes, a humiliation that cut Rome to the core. The legions, specifically the 17th, 18th, and 19th, were annihilated so completely that their numbers were never again assigned to Roman forces, a silent but powerful testament to the disaster. In Rome, the news struck like thunder. Augustus, the emperor who had brought stability and expansion, was said to have wandered his palace, beating his head against the walls and crying out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." It was more than a military defeat, it was a psychic wound to the empire, a reminder that Rome was not invincible. The strategic consequences were enormous. The Rhine, not the Elbe, became the permanent frontier of the Roman world. While later emperors such as Germanicus attempted to avenge the disaster with punitive expeditions into Germania, the dream of annexing the region as a full Roman province was abandoned. Germania remained a land beyond, dangerous and untamed, its tribes never fully conquered. The massacre also emboldened other enemies, showing that Rome could be beaten under the right conditions. Yet in a paradoxical way, it strengthened the empire's resolve to hold the line and consolidate rather than overextend. The limits of Roman expansion had been drawn in blood. For centuries, the massacre of Teutoburg Forest remained a symbol of the dangers of overconfidence and the perils of unfamiliar terrain. It showed that even the most disciplined army could falter when drawn into an environment where its strengths were nullified. It demonstrated the power of local knowledge, the effectiveness of ambush, and the importance of intelligence in warfare. Arminius, once a Roman citizen, became a hero to his people and later to German nationalists, who saw in him the defender of their homeland against foreign domination. To Rome, he was both a traitor and a genius, the man who had turned their own training against them. The disappearance of 20,000 elite soldiers was not simply a matter of men lost, but of an empire forced to confront its limitations. The echoes of that defeat reverberated long after the bodies had decomposed in the forest. Archaeological finds in modern times, piles of bones, weapons, and coins, testify to the scale of the destruction. The forest itself seemed to swallow the legions, leaving little behind but ghostly remnants. For the Roman soldiers who marched into the Teutoburg that fateful autumn, it was not just a defeat, but an erasure, as though they had been consumed by the land itself. For Rome, it was a reminder that even the greatest empire could bleed, that ambition unchecked by caution could lead to disaster, and that the memory of 20,000 men could vanish into the mists of history, leaving behind a legend as dark and impenetrable as the forest in which they fell. Roman expansion under Augustus and the dream of conquering Germania. In the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire under Augustus was at the height of its power. Having secured dominance over the Mediterranean, crushed Cleopatra's Egypt, and subdued Gaul under Julius Caesar, the empire seemed unstoppable. Augustus, ever the architect of Rome's destiny, envisioned pushing its frontiers further north and east. Germania, a vast and untamed land filled with thick forests, unpredictable rivers, and warlike tribes, appeared to be the next logical conquest. The Rhine River already served as a Roman stronghold, with numerous forts and settlements anchoring Roman presence. To the Romans, Germania was not just another land, it was a test of their civilizing mission. They believed they could bring order, law, roads, and urban life to a land they considered barbaric. Roman generals saw the conquest as a way to secure personal glory, while Augustus saw it as a means of stabilizing Rome's borders against potential incursions. The empire had grown used to victory, and there was little doubt that Germania would eventually fall. Yet beneath this confidence lay a fatal underestimation of the tribe's resilience, terrain, and leadership potential. It was this ambition that would ultimately draw 20,000 Roman soldiers into a trap from which none would return. The reputation and strength of the Roman legions. The Roman legions were not just soldiers, they were the embodiment of imperial power, professional warriors trained to fight with precision and endurance. A single legion contained around 5,000 men, supported by cavalry, auxiliaries, and engineers. Their discipline was legendary, able to march for miles, dig fortified camps overnight, and assemble into lethal formations like the testudo, a shielded wall that could withstand a hail of arrows. Their weapons were standardized, the short gladius for stabbing, the pilum for throwing, and heavy rectangular shields for defense. The legionary system relied on strict hierarchy, with centurions enforcing discipline through relentless drills and harsh punishments. In open battle on plains, the legions were nearly invincible, capable of overwhelming larger numbers with superior organization. To their enemies, they were the unstoppable machine of Rome. The psychological effect of facing legions was immense. Many tribes capitulated without a fight. This aura of invincibility made the soldiers themselves confident to the point of arrogance, believing no barbarian horde could truly challenge them. Yet what made the legions strong in conventional warfare also made them vulnerable in environments they were unaccustomed to: swamps, forests, and unpredictable guerrilla attacks. In Teutoburg, these elite soldiers would discover that their greatest strengths could also become fatal weaknesses. The role of Publius Quinctilius Varus. Publius Quinctilius Varus, the general entrusted with Germania, was not a man famed for military genius, but for his loyalty and administrative skills. He came from a prominent Roman family and had served in Syria, where his governance was marked by severity and heavy taxation. Augustus valued him as a man who could impose Roman order in newly conquered territories. In Germania, however, Varus's heavy-handedness and arrogance made him deeply unpopular among the tribes. He demanded obedience, levied taxes, and treated the local people as if they were already Roman subjects, failing to recognize their fierce independence. To his soldiers, Varus seemed confident and authoritative, but in truth, he lacked the flexibility and cunning of great Roman generals like Caesar or Agrippa. When Arminius, a trusted ally, suggested marching into the interior to suppress rebellion, Varus accepted without question. His inability to read the situation, his overconfidence in Roman power, and his blind trust in a man who was secretly plotting against him sealed the fate of his army. Varus would ultimately meet his end, not on the field of glory, but in despair, taking his own life as his legions collapsed around him in the German forest. Arminius's upbringing in Rome. Arminius, the architect of Rome's disaster, was a man shaped by both Roman and Germanic worlds. Born into the Cherusci tribe, he was sent as a hostage to Rome in his youth, part of the empire's policy of ensuring tribal loyalty. In Rome, Arminius was educated in Latin, trained in Roman military tactics, and granted Roman citizenship along with the rank of equestrian. He fought in Roman campaigns and gained a reputation as a capable officer. To Roman commanders, he appeared the model of a loyal ally, a bridge between empire and tribe. Yet beneath this Roman exterior lay an unshakable loyalty to his people and a growing resentment of Roman arrogance. Arminius saw firsthand how Rome subdued and assimilated conquered lands, stripping them of independence. He realized that if Germania were fully absorbed, his people would lose their identity. What made him dangerous was not just his charisma or leadership, but his intimate knowledge of Roman strategy. He understood their formations, their reliance on discipline, and their vulnerabilities in rough terrain. Arminius was not a wild barbarian chief, but a strategist who could think like a Roman while leading Germans. In this duality lay the brilliance that allowed him to orchestrate one of Rome's greatest defeats. The illusion of loyalty to Varus and the Roman command. Arminius was the perfect ally. He spoke fluent Latin, had fought bravely alongside Roman troops, and consistently presented himself as committed to Rome's mission in Germania. His noble background among the Cherusci made him a valuable intermediary, someone who could secure tribal cooperation. Varus relied heavily on Arminius for intelligence and counsel, believing him to be trustworthy. This illusion of loyalty was carefully cultivated. Arminius attended Roman councils, shared meals with officers, and maintained the facade of friendship, even as he quietly forged alliances among the tribes. The Romans failed to notice his absences, his secret messages, and his subtle manipulation of events. In truth, Arminius was planning a rebellion so carefully concealed that Varus dismissed any warnings of betrayal as paranoia. Another German noble, Segestus, even warned Varus about Arminius's treachery, but Varus, blinded by confidence, ignored him. This misplaced trust would prove catastrophic. The deception worked so perfectly that by the time Varus realized the truth, it was far too late. The Roman reliance on loyalty from a man torn between two worlds ended with the destruction of 3 legions and the collapse of Roman ambitions in Germania. The fabricated rebellion. The trap was set with reports of rebellion among distant Germanic tribes. Arminius presented this information to Varus, insisting that swift action was necessary to demonstrate Roman authority. In reality, no such rebellion existed. It was a fabrication designed to lure the legions away from the safety of their strongholds along the Rhine. Varus, eager to assert control and perhaps win glory for himself, believed the story without question. He prepared to march 3 full legions, around 20,000 men, into the interior. Along with soldiers came camp followers, families, and wagons carrying supplies, making the column vast and slow. The march would take them into the Teutoburg forest, a place Varus did not know well, but where Arminius' forces were already hidden and prepared. To Roman minds, suppressing rebellion was routine. To Arminius, it was the perfect way to lead them into isolation. The genius of the plan lay in its simplicity: exploit Roman arrogance, make them believe they were quelling resistance, and then strike when they were deep in hostile territory. Once Varus agreed, the fate of his legions was sealed. They were marching not to suppress unrest, but into a carefully engineered killing ground, the terrain of Teutoburg Forest. The Teutoburg Forest was unlike the battlefields, where Roman legions excelled. It was a dense, tangled wilderness of towering trees, marshy ground, and narrow trails. Heavy rain soaked the land, turning paths into mud, slowing wagons and exhausting men and animals. Visibility was limited. The canopy overhead blocked sunlight, leaving the forest dim and oppressive. Roman formations, designed for open plains, could not be maintained here. The long marching column stretched for miles, with soldiers, supplies, and non-combatants spread out along the trail. Communication between units was difficult, and the constant sound of dripping rain and rustling leaves heightened unease. For the Romans, it was disorienting. For the Germans, it was home. The tribes knew every path, swamp, and vantage point. They had cut ambush routes, fortified positions, and prepared traps to exploit Roman vulnerability. The environment itself became a weapon. Armor grew heavy when soaked, bows lost tension in the damp, and campfires could barely burn. Soldiers who prided themselves on order and precision found themselves stumbling through chaos. The Teutoburg Forest stripped Rome of its greatest strengths, turning the disciplined legion into a clumsy, vulnerable mass of men, ripe for ambush by warriors who thrived in such terrain. Preparation of the Germanic tribes. The success of Arminius's plan depended on uniting the often fractious Germanic tribes. Traditionally, these groups were independent, proud, and prone to infighting. Yet Arminius, with his charisma and vision, persuaded them that Rome was a threat to all, not just one tribe. He argued that if Rome established permanent control, their lands, gods, and freedom would vanish. Slowly, the Cherusci, Bructeri, Chatti, and others rallied under his leadership. Together, they prepared the ambush with meticulous care. They built wooden barricades in the forest to channel Roman movements, dug concealed pits, and placed warriors in hidden positions. The tribes were lightly armed compared to Romans, wielding spears, axes, and shields, but they had the advantage of mobility and terrain knowledge. Unlike the rigid Roman formations, they could melt into the forest after striking, only to appear again in another spot. Their war cries echoed through the trees, designed to sow fear and confusion. For once, the tribes were united by a single goal: the destruction of the invading legions. By the time Varus entered the forest, Arminius's trap was fully set, a carefully orchestrated plan that turned the Germanic warriors into executioners of Rome's greatest army. The ambush begins. As the Roman column wound its way deeper into the forest, the first attack struck. At first they seemed like minor skirmishes, arrows and javelins hurled from the trees, sudden charges from hidden warriors. But soon the scale became clear. The legions were surrounded. The Germans attacked from all sides, their war cries piercing the forest air. Romans tried to form defensive lines, but the narrow paths and thick woods prevented proper formations. Wagons clogged the routes, cavalry could not maneuver, and the rain turned the ground into a mire. Soldiers raised shields against the hail of missiles, but their long lines left gaps that were quickly exploited. Panic began to spread as men realized they were fighting an invisible enemy, striking and vanishing into the trees. Centurions shouted commands, struggling to impose order, but each attempt was drowned out by chaos. The initial ambush shattered the illusion of control, and the Romans were forced into desperate survival. What Varus had believed to be a routine march had become a death trap. For the Germans, it was the moment they had been waiting for, the chance to bleed Rome and prove that even legions could be broken. The prolonged slaughter. The battle did not end in a single clash. It dragged on for days. The Roman column, harassed at every step, tried to push forward but was constantly attacked. Supplies dwindled, men went without food or rest, and the endless rain soaked their clothes and armor. Exhaustion gnawed at their strength. Germanic warriors would strike suddenly, killing dozens, then vanish into the woods before Romans could counterattack. Each night brought no safety, as the tribes continued their assaults, keeping the soldiers awake and fearful. The wounded suffered without aid, their cries adding to the despair. Standards, the symbols of legionary honor, were lost as units were annihilated. Some Romans tried to cut their way through, others dug makeshift defenses, only to be overrun. Morale collapsed as soldiers realized escape was impossible. The once proud legions were reduced to fragmented groups fighting for survival. The prolonged nature of the slaughter made it even more terrifying, as death seemed inevitable but never swift. What had begun as a disciplined march now resembled a desperate retreat through hell itself. The forest, rain, and constant attacks worked together to grind down 20,000 elite soldiers, until only scattered survivors remained. The death of Varus. As the situation spiraled beyond salvation, Publius Quinctilius Varus faced the ultimate humiliation. A Roman commander could not endure capture by barbarians, for it meant torture, mockery, and the desecration of his dignity. Realizing his legions were doomed, Varus chose suicide rather than dishonor. He fell upon his sword, ending his life in the forest that had become his tomb. His death symbolized the collapse of command, leaving the already demoralized soldiers leaderless. With their general gone, any remaining cohesion disintegrated. Officers tried to rally troops, but panic spread quickly. Units deserted their positions, soldiers scattered, and small groups attempted to flee into the woods, only to be hunted down. The suicide of Varus also reflected the depth of betrayal he must have felt, realizing too late that the man he trusted most, Arminius, had engineered his downfall. For Rome, Varus's death would become infamous, a symbol of failed leadership and blind arrogance. In the forest, however, it was simply one more Roman corpse among thousands, a reminder that even generals of the world's greatest empire were not immune to fate when arrogance met cunning resistance. The fate of the legions. The destruction of the legions was absolute. The 17th, 18th, and 19th legions, elite formations of Rome's army, ceased to exist. Survivors were few, and many who were captured faced gruesome ends. Some were sacrificed to Germanic gods, their heads displayed on trees as trophies. Others were enslaved, doomed to live as reminders of Rome's humiliation. Most were simply slaughtered in the mud and rain of the forest. The sacred legionary standards were seized, a devastating blow to Roman honor. The annihilation was so complete that Rome never again reconstituted the 17th, 18th, or 19th legions. Their numbers were cursed, erased from the rolls of Rome's military history, as if to acknowledge the disaster should never be repeated. For the families of the soldiers, grief was compounded by the lack of closure. Most bodies were never recovered, their bones left to rot in the forest. It was not just a defeat, it was erasure. 20,000 men vanished, swallowed by the Teutoburg forest, leaving behind only ghostly remnants that centuries later would be uncovered by archaeologists. For Rome, it was the single greatest military catastrophe in living memory. The reaction in Rome. News of the disaster struck Rome like a thunderbolt. Augustus, the emperor who had guided Rome into stability and expansion, was devastated. Ancient accounts say he wandered his palace in despair, tearing at his clothes and crying out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." The loss of 20,000 men was not just military, but psychological. Rome, long accustomed to victory, now had to face the reality of utter defeat. Politically, it was a crisis. Enemies within and without questioned Rome's invincibility. Panic spread among citizens, who feared that Germanic warriors might soon pour across the Rhine. Reinforcements were rushed to secure the frontier, fortresses strengthened, and defensive measures prioritized. The Senate was shaken, for it revealed that even Augustus's careful leadership could not prevent catastrophe. Yet Rome did not collapse. The empire mourned, grieved, and raged, but it also resolved to avenge the defeat. Expeditions were launched under Tiberius, and later Germanicus, though none fully erased the memory of Teutoburg. The reaction in Rome underscored how deeply the empire identified with its legions. Their destruction was not just a military loss, but an emotional wound carved into the heart of the empire. The long-term consequences. The massacre had profound consequences for the future of the Roman Empire. Before Teutoburg, Augustus had envisioned extending Rome's border to the Elbe River, making Germania a Roman province much like Gaul. After the disaster, this dream was abandoned. The Rhine became the permanent frontier, fortified with garrisons and watchtowers. Germania was left beyond, untamed and unconquered. Though Roman generals like Germanicus launched punitive campaigns to recover honor, the idea of full annexation was discarded. The psychological scar was too deep, and the practical risks too great. The disaster also reshaped Roman military policy. Expansion slowed, and defensive consolidation became the priority. The empire realized it could not expand indefinitely. Natural boundaries like rivers and mountains were better frontiers than endless campaigns. In a sense, Teutoburg defined the limits of Rome. Had the legions not been destroyed, the empire might have absorbed Germania, potentially altering the cultural and political shape of Europe. Instead, the massacre preserved Germanic independence, which centuries later would play a key role in the fall of Rome itself. Thus, the consequences of Teutoburg were not temporary. They reverberated for generations, shaping the very trajectory of Western history. Legacy of Teutoburg. The massacre of Teutoburg Forest became legend. For Rome, it was remembered as a cautionary tale of arrogance, betrayal, and the dangers of underestimating so-called barbarians. The names of the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions remained cursed, never to be raised again. For Germans, it was a story of triumph, where tribal unity and cunning defeated the mightiest empire on earth. Arminius, reviled in Rome as a traitor, became a hero in German memory, celebrated centuries later as Hermann the Liberator, a symbol of resistance to foreign domination. Archaeological discoveries of mass graves, weapons, and coins have only deepened the sense of awe at the scale of destruction. Strategically, Teutoburg taught the importance of respecting terrain, intelligence, and local knowledge in warfare. Culturally, it defined the limits of Romanization and preserved Germanic independence. The forest itself, with its damp soil and looming trees, became an almost mythical sight, a place where 20,000 soldiers seemed to vanish into the earth.
The legacy of Teutoburg is not just about defeat or victory, it is about how a single battle can alter the course of empires, shaping identities, frontiers, and the memory of entire civilizations.